there are some things that you find in this film that are kind of quintessentially Chinese. So for example, at one point, Dr. Zhu is approached by a swindler. He thinks it's a patient and he misdiagnoses the man as having a tumor or something. And in the English, it doesn't fully translate the response of the doctor. But what he actually says in Chinese is the man is trying to sell him a Qianlong era vase, and he offers to sell a Kangxi era pen holder. And so you'd have to know that Kangxi was, a couple of generations before Qianlong to appreciate the joke about relative value here. You even have things that are that would only be caught by a Chinese audience, probably. For example, one of the first things that Carpenter Zheng does when he is in his fruit stall is he saws a melon in half. And in Chinese, to po gua, or to split open a melon, is to take a woman's virginity. And so this would be a kind of smutty language joke that would be, it's not mentioned on, it is because it's impolite, but it is definitely there. And it kind of presages the union later on. So we see also, if we put Harold Lloyd and Labor's Love side by side, that there's a certain iconography that you can see. And the very first issue of the Motion Picture Review in China, the Chinese language film magazine or fanzine, showed Harold Lloyd on the cover. And you could buy Harold Lloyd style glasses in many places. So there's one point where Carpenter Zheng puts on the goggles or puts on the glasses and he's kind of adopting that look. And we even see a similar type of spectacle on Dr. Zhu, who's played by the screenwriter Zheng Zhengqiu, who in real life also wore the style of glasses. So I think this is a prop that was handy for them, as well as recognizable to audiences at that time. And you had a lot of this going on. So you would have Laurel and Hardy style pairs. So Han Langen and Yin Xiuchen were household names in the 1930s and 40s especially. Although there's, again, some Chinese differences, and there's a film made by Lian Hua in 1937 where you have, I think, one Laurel and two Hardys. So you have two fat men and one skinny man there. So we're upping the ante. You also had, a Chinese Shirley Temple, various child actors vying for that status. And to kind of capitalize on the popularity, the well-known popularity of the child film, you had films like Cecil B. DeMille's Don't Change Your Husband being recreated about a decade later and reinvented. So there's a lot of films from the 1920s that have to do with domestic matters and marital institutions. D.W. Griffith was very influential. And again, you can see, the Orphan of the Storm here, that the framing is a bit still stunted. It's somewhat cut off. And that's an unfortunate problem we have with a lot of early Chinese films, including Labor is Love. We have Street Angel in Hollywood that won an Oscar. We have Street Angels in China, also talking about vulnerable female runaways. And we also see into the 1930s a lot of, copying of Hollywood and trying to capitalize on success. Although when you look at the filmmaker's memoirs, at Sun Yu's memoirs about making Sports Queen, he does not mention this influence necessarily. We have Chinese versions of Phantom of the Opera with a revolutionary subplot added in to the horror, the Gothic horror, and the look. We have films like The Great Road, which is a fantastic mixed genre work that has a ton of slapstick comedy in it, but which also draws on these moral dramas from Hollywood, like I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, with a lot of fleshy, manly men being depicted. So this book that I wrote really starts with Labor is Love. That's chapter 1. And it helps to kind of situate what was going on in Chinese cinema at that time. And there's, I think, a ton of creativity in this era before the communist success in the revolution, and when you had the nationalization of the film industry beginning in the 1950s. So by 1952, there essentially was a top-down mandate that no more private enterprise. It's all going to be, all of the stories are going to be by and for the people under the direction of the party. And so you lose a little bit of this, go-getter, can-do, individual initiative spirit. But you can even see as late as the 1940s, people showing film and radio as being real engines of progress in the iconography of trade publications. So I've been spending quite a lot of time, especially since the pandemic, in translating films from this era and just making them publicly available for free. So I've both translated over 20 films. I'm now working with several other translators to translate the films in full, these open access films that are out of copyright, to also then slice and dice them so that we can watch different clips. So if you want to hear all of the songs from the 1930s and 40s, you can do that on the Sounds of Early Chinese Cinema playlist. If you want to watch all the animated sequences, you can do that on the animation playlist. I have another about shared cinematic motifs, where if you're curious about funny staircases and connection devices, you can see them there. And I've also built a website. So since our time today is limited, I just wanted to mention that if you are interested to watch more comedies or other types of film from that period, they're all on YouTube, and there's some supplementary information about them on this website, and even a course. So I've mentioned a few points from kind of my reading of Labor is Love and what some other scholars have pointed out about the film. But if you go to the online course section on this, you can find information about this and 10 other courses as well, including the video lectures that I've created on it, each about 10 to 15 minutes long, that go into the film in a little bit more detail than I have tonight. The last thing I want to mention, since I showed a clip from this 1929 film, that I have recruited a student in the US. He is someone who contacted me out of the blue after I started this YouTubing project, who turns out to be a high school student, 16 years old. And he has translated the subtitles or the intertitles for Woman Warrior, White Rose, and we'll be posting it very soon. So those are just some preliminary remarks, and I look forward to discussing the film with you. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. I don't see any questions yet. If you have any questions, there's a Q&A at the bottom, or you could put them in chat and I will answer them. In the meantime, actually, I have a few of my own, so I'm going to interject them while everyone else is writing. I've been sort of studying the silent era of US films. And what I've come to understand is something like 80% of all silent films are gone, never to be seen again. And that the reason is they were made of nitrate, which was explosively flammable, that they were stored in warehouses that had fires, that the studios who stored them basically saw no commercial value and literally dumped them into the bay. And a lot of times we try to restore some of these, some of the movies, we're finding copies of them in far off places like Latvia, where the prints were delivered and weren't destroyed. So I wonder, Chris, if you could say something about early Chinese films and what portion of those still exist and how are they treated?
I'm really glad you asked this. And there's still quite a bit of mystery surrounding this, but I can give a couple of examples. First of all, the Chinese film industry up to 1940s was centered in Shanghai. Shanghai was bombed by the Japanese in 1932, and they specifically bombed the northern part of the city where a lot of the publishing industry was and a lot of the film studios were located. And so a bunch of films were lost as a result of the Japanese invasion. You did have some, destruction in later historical eras too, right? During the Mao era in particular, you did also have, a lot of fly-by-night studios that never really succeeded, and their films were just not transmitted well. I'd be very curious to know if there are archives in Southeast Asia that preserve some of these early films, because Southeast Asia was the crucial overseas market for early Chinese films. You might, the success or failure of your company may depend on selling a print or two of your film in Singapore or Malaya or Hong Kong or something like that. But I will say I've had the great good fortune to be in touch with the National Library of Norway, which has just a few years ago discovered a copy of a 1920s film that was thought lost It's an adaptation of a scene from Journey to the West. And the copy that they have has both Chinese and Norwegian intertitles, which do not match. And so just like in Labor's Love, you have some jokes in the Norwegian that are not in the Chinese. And so they very kindly provided this film to me to include on the channel. I'm translating the Chinese subtitles right now. They have provided an English translation of the Norwegian intertitles. And so that's another one that's coming up soon. But yes, you have some films that are in Taiwan because they went to Taiwan with the nationalists. And there is indeed a diaspora. But I think the part of the Chinese story that's a little different is the bombing of Shanghai and the 15-year-long war with Japan since 1931 to 45, and the Civil War as well. So a lot was lost.
Okay, great. Okay, I have a comment from a Sichuan Gun. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, who says, "Thank you, Professor Rea, for your interesting presentation. I learned a lot from your talk. I don't have questions, but just a comment to share. Your interpretations about splitting the melon and curing patients as fixing some products in your YouTube channel, as well as your comparison with that Chinese-American made film, inspired me to see this film from the perspective of gender. On one hand, there are undoubtedly many representations about historical changes at that time, such as the love-free marriage. But on the other hand, it seems the young girl's position is never as positive as men. She is always treated like a thing by both her father and by her lover. And somehow this reminds me of Shu Lun's cannibalism, this frequent motif in modern Chinese arts. That is, interhuman consumption seems inevitable, and there is always some invisible cannibalism. Maybe it is true that the core of the comedy is always tragedy. Anyway, thank you for your lecture. Really fascinating."
Yeah, thank you so much for that comment. And yeah, and Lu Xun was famously pessimistic and excoriated Chinese culture for all of the accumulated horrors of Confucianism and subjugation of women. And he had, famous speeches about, even in the 1920s, we can't all be like Nora from Ibsen's A Doll's House. We can't just like leave the safety of marriage and women strike out on their own. They'll just fall into prostitution or they'll have to go back home. They're still subjugated and dependent on men. I think that Labor's Love has a much lighter touch on this type of issue, including gender relations. And yes, I think this is in some ways dramatizing, right, the commoditization of women. But again, the father is not fully in control here. And he is outwitted, or he's outmaneuvered in some ways by the children. And so I think you end with something of a comedy of reconciliation where everybody is pleased in this family, all three of them. So there's a type of harmony being shown here. And we're not really worried about social realities in this film. But I do take your point that this is a great cause for concern. And in some ways, Lu Xun won the day in that his stories were told and retold. He was heavily canonized. Films like this really, if this film had not, if it was one of several, it would really be considered kind of an ephemeral cultural product. But I think we can also view it as being something of a mainstream type of production for that time period, and where we have testimonies from industry observers who really said that this type of light-hearted comedy is really what carried the day. It was really what drew people to theaters at this time. So I think they were still quite popular. But I would also say that the film market was quite diverse as well. And so, yeah, if you look on the YouTube channel, there's tons of melodrama. There are a lot of films that showed gender representations in a much more negative light. And one film that I mentioned in passing, Don't Change Your Husband, lovely title, right? That completely blames the woman for not being, and shows the husband in a sympathetic light, and the woman is making a mistake by wanting to seek a divorce. And so even though there's some farcical elements in that, definitely the gender prejudice of the age were very much in favor of men.
Okay. Willow Zhang would like to know, do you teach Chinese classic films for your students to learn Chinese culture, or mainly Chinese film?
So for the film courses that I teach, most of them are taught in English, and they use films with English subtitles. So I have one that's mostly using films that I've translated, a Chinese film classics course. But I also teach contemporary films, up to the last 5-10 years or so. And so that's partly determined by availability. I also teach Chinese language, and I have occasionally used films in that to teach students different idioms of spoken Chinese. And I think it's a good test when you have films where you can have text on screen, like the Chinese text, to try to read it at the speed of natural speech, or at least dramatized speech. But most of the enrollments, it's for students who don't know any Chinese.
Okay. Jim Mockford says, thanks, Professor Rea. Do you have any comments about the Japanese, quote, Chinese actress known in China as Li Xianglan, born Yoshiko Yamaguchi in Liaoning, and known later as Shirley Yamaguchi? We discussed selecting one of her films as Li Xianglan, and perhaps you have a recommendation.
I wish you good luck in finding a high quality copy of a Li Xianglan film with English subtitles. There are poor quality copies of some of her films available on YouTube without English subtitles. There is one called Wan Shi Liu Fang, which has variously been translated as Eternity and Glory to Eternity, which I think is ungrammatical, or The Opium War. And this is a fascinating film from 1943, now get this, it was commissioned by the Japanese authorities to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Nanking and the end of the Opium War, First Opium War. And it was a Shanghai Manchukuo co-production. And so Li Xianglan appears in it as the main contribution from the Manchukuo film industry. And then you have a couple of female stars. I think the most famous of the day was Nancy Chan, or Chen Yunshang, who had just appeared in 1939 as, get this, Hua Mulan. She had played the consummate woman warrior who protects China from foreign invasion. But now she and Shirley Yamaguchi are appearing in this film about the Opium War, and it's a musical. So Li Xianglan sings about selling candy when she's talking about selling opium. There's a lot of scenes set in opium dens, but it's really about the great Chinese official hero who burned the opium stocks and stood up to the British. But his heroic narrative is kind of subsumed into this love triangle story. So it's a weird film, and it has absolutely hilarious white face acting in it, with Chinese playing British, talking about both men and women. So unfortunately, this film has not been translated in full. I've been in touch with Po Shek Fu, a historian who's the expert on wartime cinema, especially traffic between Hong Kong and Shanghai. But I have not yet seen a really high quality copy of this film. It's a very controversial film for political reasons, but yes, if you can get a Li Xianglan film, let me know, because I want to watch it. And that film's like 2.5 hours long, so I'd love to translate it, but it's going to take a little time.
Thank you. By the way, anyone interested in Manchukuo, I can tell you it's an interesting area for stamp collecting, the stamps of Manchukuo. Alexia Stefan says, how did you get involved and started on this project? I don't know if she means the project or into Chinese cinematography and films.
I think the main reason would be, and I've done a lot of research on the culture of late Qing and Republican China. So like the 80s, 1890s, up through the 1940s. And I had mostly, for my first book on comedy, it was mostly about print culture. So like jokes that were published and stage plays and novels and the like. But I had also in graduate school taken a course, a graduate seminar on early Chinese drama and film and the connections between the stage industry and the film industry. And so that's where I first watched a lot of these old black and white films. And some of them I just kind of stuck with me. Some of them I had been teaching at UBC for about a decade. And talking with my publisher, I was really interested in doing a project on film. And she said, that sounds fantastic. And so I'm someone who really wants to understand these films on their own terms and on whatever terms were imposed on them at the time period. So I essentially decided to write this book that is 14 films, one chapter per film, trying to understand it in relation to audience and history and language and culture. And so it's a very subjective selection. There are a lot of other great films I could have chosen, but these are ones that I thought were really stand out for some reason. So that's how I got involved. And then the translation thing really picked up when everyone suddenly had to teach online. And I realized a lot of my colleagues were in the same situation as me. And we all we couldn't go to the library and we couldn't have students come to class and watch the film. So I just decided to go ahead and translate. And I worked with a couple of my PhD students on the subtitling.
Okay, Jeff Kinkley asks a question, and I think I'm going to make this the last question. There are actually two questions here. The first question, I'll ask you, Chris, to answer them kind of together. I suppose the measuring of the melon at the start of the film was an imitation of what a carpenter would do, not a fruit seller. I think you've answered that kind of. That's a yes. Jeff also says, I didn't see much class consciousness. Idle rich gambling upstairs, and there was a bullied landlord, but his ne'er-do-wells looked pretty lumpen. I'm assuming Jeff means like lumpen proletariat. There were upper-class literati characteristics among both the father-in-law hero, as well as at least one of the gamblers. Those eyeglasses and the old-fashioned caps. Nice special effects, both blurred vision and an inset of the hero dreaming of his love in the upper left corner.
Yes. First of all, the first question is easy. Yeah, there are, I think, a few visual gags there of him trying to treat the fruit as if he's a carpenter. So what he uses like a carpenter's plane to take the skin or the husk off a sugar cane, that type of stuff. And the measuring tools that he's using, all that stuff, it's referring to his earlier trade. So yeah, that's a good catch. As for the class consciousness, I think it's pretty muted. There's no overtones. If at most there's undertones. So I don't think it's, you could read stuff into it like, okay, we have like upstairs, downstairs stuff. And there is some social climbing. Like the carpenter literally becomes a doctor when he steps into the clinic and he starts treating patients. And he brings the gamblers down literally with the staircase slide. So I think you could say there may be a little allegory there, but I think that is a creative or interpretive possibility. But the special effects, like that was pretty mainstream stuff. And if you went into photo studios, even in smaller cities, you could get that kind of trick photograph made of like you shaking hands with yourself or playing chess with yourself or driving yourself in a car. So I think that audiences were used to that type of trick cinematography. And you even find it in later dramatic films like Goddess, or this Ranning Yu film from 1934. The very last shot is a matte shot. Same trick, slightly more smoothly done.
I noticed that in terms of technique, it was pretty primitive. No panning, no zooming, fixed perspective. But okay, enough of the questions. Just a couple of closing things here. First of all, thank you for everyone joining us tonight. Just a reminder that the book Chinese Film Classics 1922 to 1949 is available on Amazon.com, Powell's.com, or your local bookstore. On Monday night, June 28th, the Northwest China Council's movie chat will meet on Zoom to discuss the movie The Great Road, made in 1934. You can find information about the movie on the China Council website under the tab Movie Night. There you'll find instructions for viewing Chris Rea's introductory lecture and the movie itself streaming on YouTube. Perfect. I got to thank you, Chris. This really helps our movie program, not only to see your probably annotated film, but also your lecture, which happens to be module number 4. If you plan on joining the discussion, please view the lecture and movie in advance at your convenience. Now, for those of you joining us for our informal discussion, you'll find the confirmation email for this China chat and look for the link that is to an open session. This is really a webinar. And Chris, this will also give you a chance to meet all the folks who are silently in the background whose picture you don't see. So on that note, I'm going to ask our Zoom genius, John Wong, to end the webinar. It is now 20 minutes after the hour. At 25 minutes after the hour, in 5 minutes, please log back on using the link to the open chat, and I hope to see you there. See you all in just a few minutes. Bye-bye,
Thank you all
everybody.
so much. Looking
You
forward
bet.
to it.